Appetite for Horror.
What is the history of metal and horror? Let's find out.
My mom took me to see the original Jaws when I was really young, and it scarred me for life.
The first VHS tape I ever had was Dawn of the Dead, and I would just let it play over and over all day long. I must have watched it thousands of times.
The movie that affected me the most was Salem's Lot.
Appetite for Horror, episode number 2. I am excited for, it's so interesting just to be 2 episodes into this podcast. And if you're listening since the beginning, since episode 1. In the beginning, if you missed the first episode, we had Michael Levy from Terrifier, actor, producer. And I also mentioned in the first episode, and we used a different version of it, which you just heard, of our intro music, which was made by Steve Darrow. I don't know if you know who he is, Ace. Steve Darrow, LA musician. He basically was in Guns N' Roses before Guns N' Roses. He told Axl to call himself Axl when he was still going by Bill. So he was in Rose, Hollywood Rose, that crazy. So what he does now, he makes with his project Sister Midnight, scary and spooky music with all the, and based on old movies and soundtracks. And Steve Darrow's it up. I'll have to think of a better adjective, a better way to. So, and obviously we also heard, I'm going to do each episode a trailer of the main movie, or the documentary in this case, that we're talking about. So Ace Von Johnson, who is my guest today, / co-host, because I'm going to be asking you about the documentary, but just also talking about horror, which is this is what this podcast is for. I need to talk about horror with somebody.
That's what we're here for to satiate our appetite for horror.
Because, which is also funny, because if you're curious who that female's voice was, that was my wife.
Oh, interesting.
Is terrified of horror movies.
Okay.
She won't like that I said this, but she flinched when we went to go see Christopher Robin, the Winnie the Pooh movie in theaters. It was like a high-speed car chase. So sometimes we'll watch, Squid Games and things like that. She has to be in the mood for it. And also Sister Midnight, Steve Darrow's music is going to be featured at the end. But I want to talk about the history, which combines the two worlds, other than the theme music of my OG podcast, Appetite for Distortion, Guns N' Roses themed, Appetite for Horror. It's a theme. We'll see what else I do. Okay. Appetite for Simpsons, Appetite for Aces. We do a whole, I don't know. we could find a whole, we'll break it down. But today, the history perfect of metal and horror. So Ace Von Johnson was the perfect guest for this, because you are featured in it from LA Guns.
Yes, sir. That's me.
And we've been following each other on Twitter for a while. You're Ace Von Johnson, correct?
Yeah.
By the way, I need to apologize in advance if I call you Van Johnson by accident.
It happens.
We had
to get Phil Lewis, we wrote it on stage once because he kept saying Ace Van Johnson, and Tracy was like, dude, it's Vaughn, and he was like, that's what I said, mate. And we're like, no, you said Van, like get in the Scooby van. We heard it. But it's okay. Van, Vaughn, Vane, whatever. Just
I'll call you Ace. The only Ace I know, other than Ventura, and I don't know him.
Fair enough.
So you retweeted it because I didn't know about it, because you're a great follow. In addition to just being part of LA Guns, this legendary Sunset Strip band that's still touring and making new music. And I believe you're not touring currently, though.
No, we wrapped up the summer tour the front half of August.
Yeah.
And we just have some weekend dates for the rest of the year, West Coast and stuff. And then we'll revamp, relaunch, etc. Next year.
I mean, there's still plenty of stuff. The fact that, again, there's new, fresh LA Gun stuff out there that you, Tracy, and Phil Lewis are killing it. But you're a great follow, not just for rock and roll purposes. I do want to give a shout out because you're great with the doggos. There's one right behind you.
Yes, there's one that you can see in frame and one that's out of frame. So if anyone hears any snoring, chewing, barking, or farting, might be the dog.
If you're listening on audio only, it's me. Okay.
So the farting's definitely me.
Because you do a lot of great promotion and charity work with pit bulls. You own both pit bulls or just one?
I have three actually.
Three,
There's
okay.
three in the house right now. The one you can see in frame here, that's Willow. She's a foster, but for all intents and purposes, she lives here now. But yeah, so there's three of them. I do predominantly pit stuff just because that's what my main passion is in when it gets into dog rescue and advocacy stuff. But I mean, it applies to all domestic pets and predominantly dogs. It's just unfortunate that the shelters, especially domestically, are overrun with pit bull types. So that's obviously it's my main focus because that's what there mostly is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to make sure we also spoke about that before we lost
Sure.
track, because again, I'm eager to talk about the history of metal and horror with you. And by the way, the clip that you heard, I mean, you heard the voices of Corey Taylor, Alice Cooper. This is a stacked lineup, which is absolutely insane. And when I asked you to come on this podcast to be my second guest, you're like, oh, I filmed that a while ago. So I'm just curious how long ago, because this I'm going to reach out to the director of this. I feel like this is not going to be my only metal and horror interview. When did you film your part?
I believe it was 2014.
Wow.
And the documentary just came out formally, I think last month. So from 14 to 22. So I mean, that's a good 8-year gap. I know the director was working on it for quite some time, and it was one of those things where, I mean, we filmed a segment that was maybe all of 10 minutes or something like that, which is edited down in the film. I'm only in it briefly for a few segments, but that being said, I know he was working on it for a while, and then enough time goes by, and you just assume it might be dead in the water, or you forget about. I mean, I had frankly forgotten that I had done it for a while, and then every periodically it would circle social media. I'd see a post or someone would be like, hey, did you that it's complete, or they're getting ready to release it. I'd be like, okay, we'll see. And so I'm glad that he was able to get it out, and I know it's won a bunch of awards in the interim, and like the artwork's great, and the directing's great, and there's like a cool sort of wraparound story that's pretty interesting as well, that includes Michael Berryman, and it really turned out to be a really great project. And I was just happy to be involved regardless, because it's just horror related, but then to see the lineup of the people involved in it, not only people that are friends or acquaintances or whatever, this, that, and the other thing, but just so many icons and household names. I mean, you get Alice Cooper and Kirk Hammett and all these, Rob Zombie's in it, and all these people, and then I'm they're like, oh, and me, so it was cool to be a part of the project. And I just finally sat down and watched it maybe a couple days ago, and I thought it was great.
I'm glad you mentioned Michael Berryman. He was the voice at the beginning, the legendary The Hills Have Eyes. He's just been in
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Yeah, a ton of stuff.
Countless. If you don't know the name, he's one of those. You know his face, because he has that. He's gotten a career off that face.
Yeah,
and we're grateful for it. So it is very cool. And I haven't seen it yet, but I did watch the trailer, and I am ridiculously excited. I want to make sure I mention the director, Mike Schiff, because I want to talk to him about this. We'll see if anyone gets the reference on this side of the podcast, but the Chinese democracy of horror documentaries.
Yeah.
So do you remember what you spoke about? Because it's interesting. It's a combination of the crossover of kind of what we are.
Mm-hmm.
We're rock fans. I mean, you happen to make a career out of it because you're cool and talented. I just talk on the radio to people like you. But we also love horror. So it's kind of like our passion, but also those horror themed movies. So do you remember what did you talk about?
I know what made it into the movie was a segment where I was talking about Pet Sematary. And there's also, I can't remember what else I was talking about in the film, but there is a snip of a brief second of me on a dais talking about, I think, horror and heavy metal at what I believe was the Rock and Shock convention in Massachusetts. I did for years and years. Gina, the owner operator, one of my closest friends in the world, sort of put the convention on hold pre-pandemic. But you know, there were a few other things that I was asked about. I believe Mike might have asked me about how I got into horror, and you know, like the obvious sort of go-to questions, you know, like what were your first horror movie memories and what scared you. A lot of that stuff obviously didn't make it into the film. I'm not sure if there's special features or anything, you know, like the unedited interviews or anything. Something like that might be cool if it's not already out there. But aside from what I recapped when I watched the movie last week, I don't remember, because it's been 8 years. So you know, I do remember where we filmed it. We filmed it upstairs at the Worcester Palladium in Massachusetts, which is this ancient building that's haunted and full of its own ghosts and whatnot, but figuratively and literally. But beyond that, that's kind of where my memory recollection ends for the project.
As a New Yorker, I learned the hard way that it's pronounced Worcester and not
Worcester.
Worcester,
Yeah.
because I started my radio career up in Cape Cod.
Oh,
Mass.
yeah.
But so let me ask those questions that didn't make the cutting board, because that's kind of why I started this podcast, to get to vent, to talk to other horror fans and people involved in films and documentaries. Where did it start for you? Do you remember your first horror film? And because there are ones that have still stuck with me to this day that are 30 years old, and I still remember, like, I watched them yesterday.
Yeah, same. It predominantly stems from my father. My earliest memories with my dad, who's long since passed, were watching old black and white films, you know, the obvious stuff, the Universal classics, Dracula, Frankenstein, you know, Bride of Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon, you know, those things. He was a big fan, avid Vincent Price fan, as am I now. And I obviously don't remember the first movie, but I can remember instances of being probably between the ages of 5 and 8 and watching films for the first time, not in any specific order, but I remember the first time that I saw The Shining. I remember the first time I saw The Thing. I remember the first time I saw The Exorcist, mostly because those were the movies that scared me, as you would expect any 6-year-old who sees The Exorcist or Scatman Crothers take an axe in the chest in The Shining, you know?
Sure.
And then we enjoyed, you know, the Wolfman and Invisible Man, stuff like that, because it was light. And so that was my bonding predominantly with my father, was instead of sports or what, you know, other sort of Americana trope nonsense you might have, was we would go to the local video store and we would each pick out a movie, and I'd pick out something that was, you know, this was the probably latter half of the 80s, maybe going to the early 90s. And you know, I'd pick out Hellraiser 2 and he'd pick out, you know, 13 Ghosts, you know, we would do each other's movie. And so that was a lot of it. And then on the flip side, my cousin Mark is a pretty well-known movie director. His name's Mark L. Lester. He directed Commando and Firestarter and Class of 1984 and Class of 1999, Pterodactyl, all these sort of horror adjacent films. And when he was filming Class of 99, which I've looked it up, I can't remember now, but I think it was like 88, 89, I would have been about 6 or 7. And so I was on set for some scenes that they were filming. And so I just remember being entrenched in this, you know, I'm in this studio in the Los Angeles area, watching them film a horror movie, basically, or sci-fi horror, whatever you want to call it. And I was like, you know, this is for me. And between that and my relationship with my father and seeing all these horror movies, etc. And then, you know, I'm wearing a Tales from the Crypt shirt, but like stealing his old, you know, creepies and famous monsters of filmland and stuff, and, you know, whatever box of stuff he had under his bed or my grandmother had in the closet. That was just how I got into it. I don't know. There's really no start to me. It was like, you know, it was like birth, horror, adult career, you know, and here we are. And so I'm, you know, in my late 30s here. And since I was a little kid, that's all aside from punk rock and, you know, dog stuff and guitars and whatnot. Collecting records, horror is my big thing.
Right on. Because I had that connection with my dad in regards to classic rock music. And I've spoken about that a lot in my other radio life. And it's something I've been thinking about in preparation of talking to you. I'm like, how did I really get into horror?
Yeah.
And I remember there was a time where, because my parents weren't really into that. My mom is a lot like my wife, which I don't know. It's a Freudian thing.
Some Freudian thing there. Yeah.
Only, not in most ways, because I couldn't date my mom, but in this way that she's just scared of everything.
Yeah.
But when Silence of the Lambs came out, that was it. Everyone needed to see it because it was Oscar buzz. It was more than a horror movie. Anthony Hopkins. And they lied to us and said we had to stay in our bedrooms all night, and the babysitter was downstairs, and they just went downstairs and watched it on HBO. So I had to see. I'm like, what is this all about? Silence of the Lambs, and and that's changing so much for me. And you show your Tales from the Crypt shirt, and that's also a perfect segue for me. You said late 30s. How we might be the same age. I'm just curious.
Technically, I'll be 40 next month, but I'm still holding on to the 30s thing. Just for the last couple weeks I have left.
I'm a few months younger than you. I turned. I'll be 40 next September.
Okay, so I'm about a year older than you, but yeah, we're about the same age.
Yeah, we're getting there. Jeez, we're getting there.
What are we? I'm a millennial, so that must mean you're a millennial too, right?
No, I do not accept that. I do not accept that. Because
Fair
we
enough.
started, especially you who's slightly older, we remember life without phones, without computers, with a remote control that was connected to the TV.
Yeah,
exactly. So we're
the last bastion of that. I'm playing in the dirt with my Hot Wheels cars, and come home when the sun goes down. It wasn't, what's my Fitbit telling me or whatever.
Right. So we were at that time where horror was few and far in between, where you saw it on HBO. Perhaps, my parents got some pay-per-view channels, more than just horror stuff. They had something that eventually they had to cancel because I was watching it too much.
What was that?
Playboy.
Oh, okay. I was like, was there a horror channel back then?
No. They would get like other things. They would play horror at night, and that's how I got into so much of it. But it was just also confusing to me because I didn't get that. Not that my dad ever really cared, but my mom was like, I can't watch that. I'm like, am I wrong for liking this? But you seem to revel in it, in love with what your dad did. So how did you take Halloween early on? Did you really get into that?
Oh yeah, I was way into Halloween. I think when I was old enough to decide for myself, probably at about 5 was when I started with because at 3, you're like a bumblebee or a princess or something innocuous. And at 5, it's funny, I just went through my mother's photo album, maybe less than a month ago, to pull out these specific photos. And I went as a very specific Bela Lugosi Dracula.
Perfect.
And my mom, we were sort of a low income house, but made the cape with a wire hanger and with the popped collar, and I saved up my little cash of nickels and pennies to buy this $5 little gold medallion like he wears or whatever, and very specific widow's peak. And I won some award at the local teen center or whatever it was, park. And I remember that was a big, I was like, yeah, I'm this is for me. And then I think the next year I went as a mummy, and it was all gauze and very involved, but also very 99-cent store, and but it was all DIY. And so I really, you said reveled. I reveled in that as a kid, and I enjoyed Halloween all year round. I remember making we were poor, and so it was very much if I wanted something, I had to make it myself. And so I would make these little shoebox dioramas out of construction paper and basically trash, stuff you throw away, the little green thing that strawberries come in, or toilet paper tubes. and I would put the white paper and I'd make a ghost and I would do them in three, like, so it was this forced perspective. I mean, I was, you know, an only child for all intents and purposes. I have an older sister, but she's my half sister. We never lived together. And so, you know, stuff like that. And there were things as a kid that my friends had, like such as boglins, you can see here in the background. I wasn't either. I think it was a combination of not allowed to have them, but most really it was, we couldn't afford them. So now as an adult, I have boxes of toys I couldn't have then. But it was all year was Halloween for me. And I remember for a while I would pull all these vintage Halloween decorations out of my mother's closet that she had from probably the maybe 50s, but 60s, 70s. And I put them up in my room, and a couple of days would go by, she wouldn't be in there, and she'd come in, she'd be like, no. This is Halloween stuff. Put this away. And I kept taking them out. I remember there was we called them a blow mold, this blow mold skeleton, a skull, this huge, and I'd put it in my window and I'd pull those shades down so she couldn't see it. And then when she'd go to work, I'd lift the thing up and I'd plug it in. And so I think eventually she just kind of, pardon the pun, gave up the ghost and let me have the spooky stuff up in my room. And that was just, how it, and now I'm, pushing 40 and my house is still covered in Halloween decorations, more or less. I mean, I collect vintage or whatever theatrical horror movie posters, one sheets, half sheets, 3 sheets, cool, quads, inserts, day bills, etc. I've got probably 30 to 40 of them up and framed in the house, and probably another 100 boxed up in this closet here. So
oh wow,
it's still all Halloween here.
I love that, and I relate to that as well. And it's interesting how that relates to horror and that relates to metal, and it's all intertwined. And that's again the theme of this documentary, the metal and horror, and that's something that I relate to, where my parents never cared, where the toys. I got all the most disgusting and scary toys, especially with the Ghostbusters.
We had good toys back then, like
we really did.
Ghostbusters stuff, and like Swamp Thing. What was that, like not Mad Monster, but like this Mad Scientist,
creepy crawlers.
But then there was some other branding, and it was like science stuff but scary. It was specifically marketed as like a spooky thing where you could like make this monster in like a slime and his guts would come out. I don't know, I'm sure someone can Google it, but in late 80s and early 90s, going in that time frame, we had a lot of cool stuff that probably would be maybe not frowned upon nowadays, but definitely I wouldn't think would be in vogue in this time frame.
But what should be in vogue, and why I was happy to speak with somebody involved in Terrifier for the first episode, is everything is tangible. Everything is tactile. It's the practical effects, and that's what I'm a fan of, and that's what the toys were like. We weren't in front of a phone. We started video games. I do remember this. Ace, you may remember. I remember my parents laughing at me when they bought me the regular Nintendo NES. And they're moving the remote like up and down, like I'm jumping, because I didn't know what to do yet. I think I was like 8 years old at the time.
I still play like that.
Exactly, but it's all again connected in theme. So what do you think it is about? I mean, do you think it's like a chicken and egg question? What came first, the metal or the horror? But
horror. But
I guess so. Sure, I guess so. Because the Black Sabbath, the movie, came first before the band. So that's that question answers itself.
I mean, it's interesting how the two have grown to become synonymous. I think it really launched in like the 90s when every horror movie had heavy metal on the soundtrack. But that even goes back to, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, all that. And Return of the Living Dead, which I wouldn't say there's any metal on that, but I mean, even 45 Graves redo of Party Time is pretty metal. And, it kept they were like flirting until probably the mid 80s. And then it's one thing. I mean, we had a long stretch of movies where it was like, oh, Scream 7 is coming out. Like what Ministry songs on the soundtrack, what Pantera song is on the new Tales from the Crypt soundtrack. So, and when some of it was a bit, blah, but a lot of it was great. I mean, not that I would consider The Crow to be formal horror, but it definitely is a you know,
Sure.
a stepchild. And that soundtrack, I mean, between, you know, you get Helmet and Pantera and Rollin's band and Stone Temple Pilots and My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult and all these sort of alternative or heavy bands. I think, no, I was gonna say Sepultura, but that's on Demon Night, you know. So, and then same thing, you know, Tales from the Crypt, Demon Night, and you know, but it does kind of go back to the beginning of heavy metal, which, you know, most people would say is basically Black Sabbath. I mean, there are metal adjacent bands, you know, Zeppelin and stuff like that, and Priest, and you know, you could even go, you know, more rock and, you know, whatever else. But the first heavy metal band is really basically Black Sabbath, who took their name from that Bava film. So you know, it right there out of the gate, it sets itself up to be, you know, bosom buddies. And and then there's the obvious, or not the obvious, but the sort of like, you know, on the nose part where, you know, oh, you like heavy metal? Okay, you're an outcast. Oh, you like horror movies? You're probably an outcast, you know, especially, you know, I don't know what it was like growing up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but I remember being a kid in the late 80s and in the 90s where it was like, oh, you like horror movies? You're a weirdo. You like punk rock? You're a weirdo. You like heavy metal? You're a weirdo. So it was real easy to be, find your niche and find your crowd amongst that group of people that were like, well, yeah, I love Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I also love Megadeth. You're like, oh, we should be friends, you know? So
That's good. That does make sense that there's a certain stigma against both of them, and it's interesting. You can almost be an outcast. You know, you're metal. Both genres, both fan bases can kind of be categorized as different or being the outcast.
I mean, they've both had, you know, their time in the spotlight of mainstream success. I mean, you know, who doesn't know the movie Exorcist, or who doesn't know who Freddy Krueger is? But that doesn't mean that everyone enjoys it. Same thing with heavy metal. But you know, I feel like, kind of like talking about the cell phone thing, where it was like pre 2000, it was considered, you know, taboo to be into heavy metal in certain places, or into horror movies, you know, at a certain age or whatever. I mean, I remember when they kept all the horror movies in the back of the video store by the adult section. It was like, oh yeah, like all the Disney stuff and action movies are up front, but if you want something scary, it's over there in the dark corner by the porn. You know, it was frowned upon. It was like the next notch above porn. You know, it was like, which is, you know, neither here nor there. But it again, like I said, it was this sort of taboo subject, which now, you know, especially with the advent of the internet and culturally speaking, I mean, everybody, you know, you go to the mall and you see like a toddler in a Jason Voorhees onesie or something like that, you know. But there was a time where we, you know, guys like us we were the weirdos, and, you know, everybody at school was like, oh, stay away from that heavy metal freak.
By the way, I love the natural soundtrack that we have here, which is almost horror-like. You have the whimpering in the background, which is a dog.
He's snoring.
He's okay.
Yeah.
And I got a lawnmower going, and it's not Jason Voorhees or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you know, but
is it the guy from Dead Alive with the lawnmower to all the zombies?
That would have been the better reference, and one of the best kills of all time.
That's a good one.
The most bloody. And I guess to talk specifics, good segue. Thank you, Ace.
Sure.
Do you have favorite, I guess, metal themed horror movies, or ones that just come to mind being like, this is a rock, it's not just a horror movie, but there's a rock and roll theme to it? I mean, you can use whatever guidelines you have. Like you said, The Crow isn't technically, but just something like, just for example, I'll just I'm at the you probably, I don't know if you've seen more horror movies than me. Probably you have. I'm sure
possible.
It's possible. But I'm at that place where a lot of them mesh together,
and
it's only the big ones that stick out. So I'm just, if you see me panning over, I'm looking at a list to remind me what I've seen.
Pan over.
Deathgasm.
Deathgasm was fun.
I enjoyed that a lot. Lords of Chaos. I enjoyed it a lot.
I know I've seen it. I don't remember much about it.
Well, that was the true story, or true-ish.
Story.
It
was like quasi documentary, right?
Yeah, and
Okay.
pretty violent. I have yet to see the Foo Fighters movie. Have
Oh,
you seen
Studio
that?
666. Yeah, I saw it in the theater. It was fun.
Okay.
You know, I didn't. I'm not gonna rave about it, but it was. If you're a horror fan and or a Foo Fighters fan, it's definitely worth seeing.
I'll say this one. This is my recommendation. One of the best horror, craziest horror movies I've seen recently.
Sure.
Uncle Peckerhead. Have you
Never.
seen Uncle Peckerhead?
Not familiar with it. No.
Please do yourself a favor, and
Okay.
whether it's today, see Uncle Peckerhead. It is crazy. It's a rock and roll following a band around, and they're involved with the demon, and let your imagination take over. So, and the name alone should make you want to watch it. Uncle Peckerhead. Come on. That's what
I knew an Uncle Peckerhead once.
See, let me ask this. That's one of my favorite things about horror is the creativity. It
Mhm.
seems to be no limits as opposed to other genres that you seem to be limited because it's real life. But you can really suspend. I mean, I don't know, maybe even more than sci-fi, because this is going to the depths of where people don't want to go.
Yeah.
Horror movies. So is
Well, I
there
mean-
something that really, I don't know. What do you love about it? I guess as a general answer, a general question about horror movies.
I don't know. I don't think I know how to answer that.
I know,
In
it's hard.
summary, I think I enjoy, like most people that are fans of horror, I enjoy being scared. I enjoy the sort of thrill of that. I enjoy the art from it. I mean, let's be honest. What's more interesting, like a Ryan Reynolds rom-com or The Thing? You know,
Right.
like visually speaking, like, you know, boy meets girl, guy falls in love, girl dumps guy, or some shit, or like
Right.
some alien from another planet that's turning into, or you know, Dracula turning into a bat, or you know, Brandon Lee coming back, talking about The Crow, coming back from the dead to exact revenge. That's more interesting to me than, you
Sure.
know, Jack Black's new slapstick comedy or whatever. So, and that's just a personal preference, but
Me
I
too.
think
Even with action films, I mean, I feel like how many explosions can you do? But when
yeah,
you
it's
tie it to
it's
horror, how many ways can you kill a person? It's like
well,
you come
yeah,
up-
and then you know, you're able, and you could say same thing with sci-fi or a few other genres, but like, you know, like look at Pinhead or Hellraiser, you know, I mean, that's something no one had ever seen before, you know, they're
Right.
literally flirting with, you know, sadomasochism and demonology and all this stuff. It's a little more interesting than like you know, a movie on World War II or you know, something like that. So it's a little bit, you know, opening your mind into, you know, like, well, what you know, a creative process of things that, you know, you know, these fictional characters and scenarios are, I would imagine to the masses more interesting than, you know, just you know, a Christmas movie, you know, like, oh, is Santa in it? Is he going to bring some kids some presents? That's cute, you know, and that's where it kind of ends. To me, I'm like, well, what planet are we exploring, or what demon is this, or what monster? What's the backstory? Why is Jason Voorhees, you know, so upset that his mom, you know, got killed in the first film, and why won't he die? You know, it's a little more interesting than, you know, I'm trying to think of a movie that came out, you know, like recently, you know, than, you know, the newest James Bond film or something like that. And, you know, not that I don't love James Bond, but it just it takes you outside of the norms. And
But
I
it's why
think-
it's your favorite. That's why you still can love James Bond. You can still
Yeah.
love all these
Oh,
other
yeah.
genres, but there's something about horror that you can just, there's so many ways to go with it that
there's no boundaries to
there's
that.
no
It's
boundaries.
like,
That's the
it's
best way to
like
put it,
infinite.
Yeah.
And we're always looking for the next, you know, it's rare that I go see a horror movie and I go, holy shit, I didn't expect that, or wow, that's a new one. And but that being said, infinitely more than if I go see a rom-com or a comedy or a this or a that, or, you know, a war film or something. You kind of know, like, all right, it's going to be probably comparable to Saving Private Ryan, or this is going to be comparable to that other rom-com, or this is going to be comparable to the other thing, you know. But if you put you know, Terrifier 2 up against, you know, I'm trying to think the opposite end of the spectrum, The Lighthouse, or something like that.
Hope floats.
Yeah, exactly. There's no there's really no common ground other than they just fall under the umbrella of being a horror or a horror subgenre. So a little bit more interest to be had, I would imagine, than guy meets girl, or a war movie or a karate movie or something like that. So not to take away from any of those, because art is subjective and blah blah blah. I'm not here to judge anyone's
of
art,
course,
but
here we got the appetite for horror, so that's just like
we
why
are here
we
to talk about horror, and like I keep repeating, but there's no boundaries, in horror, so it doesn't even have to, I mean, I've seen great horror films where nobody even dies. This doesn't have to necessarily be gory or have a monster or have a this or that. It's all relatively subjective. So that's what I like about it.
And I want that's what we're here for. Talk about what we like. And I want to know, as we all do, because there are obviously a ton of horrible horror movies, but that doesn't make them bad. It's like sometimes the best ones are the worst ones.
Yeah.
Right. But I want to know what your favorite horror movie. When I say favorite, though, I say that because sometimes your favorite doesn't have to be one of the greatest of all time. Your personal favorite, not the best one. Your personal favorite horror movie of all time.
In order to give a stern answer, I have to split it at about 1980. I can't, because to me, you also can't compare, Lon Chaney as Phantom of the Opera. You can't compare that to Slither. So let's say pre 80, my favorite is House on Haunted Hill. I think it's sort of Vincent Price's like tour de force. It's like an amalgamation of all of his characters in one. And you've got a murder mystery, and you've got ghosts, and you've got a little bit of gore for the time. There's a missing head, and this skeleton arises out of a vat of acid and pushes people into it, etc. And then after I think more contemporary over the last 40 years or so, it varies. I would say probably The Shining, which is actually 1980, only because it still is an uncomfortable watch for me. It still scares me. It scared me as a child. I think I had to sleep in my dad's room for 2 nights after watching it, and I was maybe about 7, old enough to stand on my own 2 feet, but still scares me. There's still scenes in that film that make me uncomfortable, which is not something I can say about a lot of films. So yeah, those would probably be my 2 if pressed. And then I would follow it up with The Exorcist.
I mean, those are all top tier answers. Top tier. I'm curious what you thought of the remake of The House on Haunted Hill with Jeffrey Rush.
I poo-pooed it for a really long time. I recently revisited it maybe 2 months ago. I enjoyed it. I didn't love it. Okay. I will say this. I thought what they did, speaking of William Castle remakes, what they did with 13 Ghosts was far more interesting in comparison to the original versus House on Haunted Hill, which sort of the opposite of 13 Ghosts, where the original 13 Ghosts was sort of like, it's all right, it's fun, get your 3D glasses out, typical William Castle romp. But I thought the original House on Haunted Hill is a 10 out of 10 film for me. So to remake it and have it be anything less than that, which it was, is subpar, versus 13 Ghosts was an okay film and they made a remake and I thought they did a great job with it. So
I gotcha.
That's my take. I'm not, obviously everything is going to get remade in our lifetime threefold. And so, I'm not here to judge anyone's project. There's been 100 Dracula movies and 50 Frankenstein films, and, to each their own. But I personally, on that one, I love Jeffrey Rush. I didn't love it. It's worth a watch. It's fun. What was that? Platinum? I think it was a Platinum Dunes when they started remaking all these films.
Okay.
To kick the doors open in the maybe early 2000s, late 90s.
Yeah. Those are one of the ones that I just remember was on HBO all the time, and I just watched it all the time. And I had to go back to see the original, so I did the opposite of you, and I had to do that a lot in the past. I don't know, several years, handful of years, where I grew up on some horror, like the Tales of the Crypt I always spoke about. All the Nightmare on Elm Streets, all the Friday the 13th I saw early on. The scene that still sticks with me after all these years was Freddy 4 when he turned her into a cockroach on the
Oh
bench
yeah.
press. Still
Yeah.
sticks with me.
Yeah.
But so I had to go back recently and watch all these.
Oh, that's where
classic
her arms.
snap back and
Yeah, I'm
snap
thinking
off.
of a different kill where he's got someone as a roach in a roach hotel and he squishes them.
She evolves into that.
Oh, is that the same kill?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
I'm pretty sure it's brilliant. So it's one of those that that's why I guess I loved practical effects. And I should also mention that in the documentary, Tom Savini, the master,
The Godfather. Yeah.
The Godfather is interviewed. But I had to start the question because sometimes when you ask about horror movies, it could be a guilty pleasure, but I'm all about guilty pleasures.
Oh,
I've seen the worst of the worst. And you know what? My favorite horror movie of all time, if you follow this short-lived podcast so far, is Killer Clowns from Outer Space.
Great movie. The Chiodo brothers. Yeah.
I hope to get somebody from the movie on this podcast. That's kind of a goal of mine because I know the video game is coming out. We've always wanted I don't know if I wanted a remake, but at least a sequel. But we're getting a video game.
Did you know that they reused a lot of those clown costumes in Ernest Scared Stupid as the trolls?
I cannot.
Yeah. I just rewatched that this week, and you can blatantly see that it's some of the same clown prosthetics.
I haven't seen that in years. So now you got to watch Uncle Peckerhead. I got to watch Ernest Scared Stupid.
That was our homework for the week.
That's our homework. I think that's what I'm going to start to do at every episode of our horror homework to do for going forward. But it's just it's very cool because Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I love it. And I want to say that I put it out on social media. If you want to follow Appetite for Horror, on Facebook, it's just Appetite FOR, and Twitter and Instagram, it's the number 4. You'll find it. But I don't know if you grew up on this either. They say it's one of the worst movies of all time. Okay, not just horror movies, worst movies of all time.
I've probably seen it then. What is it?
Troll 2.
Oh yeah. Oh,
that
I'm a fan of the Troll franchise.
Thank you. We're best friends already. To this day, and I posted.
Was it set in the fictional town of Nilbog or whatever?
I forget. What sticks in my mind, like the first time I saw it, was that baseball rolling down the stairs saying "Yummy," "Mommy tastes good," and him going to find his mom in the kitchen. All these trolls, which is no CGI. The worst, what they are. Little people in costumes just eating green slime, and it sticks with me to this day.
There was a really great era in the 80s, and partly brought to us by Tom Savini and others, where obviously practical effects was all there was, but we didn't have stuff like that. I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of started it with like how far can we push the envelope, not only with gore and stuff like that, but with just anything practical effects. And so you had in the 80s, you had Critters and Gremlins and Killer Clowns from Outer Space and Return of the Living Dead and all these great visceral, let's say, characters, monsters, whatever you want to call them, that were all The Thing. I mean, I could talk about that movie for an hour unto itself. All these great monsters or baddies, and we haven't really seen anything like it since then, because once we got into the 90s, everyone started resting on their laurels with all the CGI stuff, some of it to the film's detriment. But now obviously stuff just looks real, but or as much as it could. But you when you mentioned Killer Clowns from Outer Space, all that era to me is such a great little bastion of cinema, whether you love the films or you think they're terrible, because whether the script was good or not, Freddy Krueger and stuff like that, he's opening his shirt and there's all little faces and all these things. I mean, that was kind of peak practical effect cinema, not talking about just horror, but I mean, I can't think of a better time for practical effects other than the 80s, especially with horror.
One of my favorite times, and even though a lot of them are faded because I saw them so young, I don't know about you, I'll give them a shout out. Tubi. Tubi, the website, has everything. It is
They have
free.
a lot of
It is
stuff.
it is amazing. However, when you're done, you check out Tubi. But what we're here to talk about is go to metalhorror.com. The history of metal and horror. They
Check
have
out the documentary.
social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I'm going to reach out to more people on that documentary because I want to talk about more metal and horror.
You
And I
should.
want, and by the way, Ace, you're welcome back anytime as
Thank you.
just to talk about
very nice.
horror. If you want to get, you saw a movie, you want to get it off your chest, or if I announce a guest and you're like, you know what, I want to interview that person too.
Okay.
You know, I'm going to say this. This is my podcast, 2 episodes in. You know way more about horror than I do. I'm here to talk about it and to learn. That's what.
Okay.
That's what.
I think we're all here to learn. Cool.
Anything to? I know we talked about LA Guns, but anything to promote specifically at this time that you have going on? You want to talk about your Patreon? Your Patreon? I'll give you.
Yeah, if anyone's interested, patreon.com/Ace Von Johnson. I'm in my into my 4th year there. It's a really wonderful platform I utilize almost daily. It's just been great. I can't speak highly enough about my group of people there, and just the means to create and share and do things. And as an artist, if you will, it's a really great support system. So check that out, even if not just for my own sake, but actors, musicians, directors, comedians. You'll find a lot of these people are on there. I have a song coming out in about 10 days.
Cool.
Later this month on the new Tiffany album. That's I Think We're Alone Now, Tiffany, the singer.
Wow.
I played on her upcoming record. I believe the release date is either the 24th or the 25th of this month. So if you'd like to hear 4 out of 5 members of LA Guns back up Tiffany on a song, Keep on Swinging, I believe is going to be one of the later singles to come out from the record. But regardless, that comes out later this month. The new LA Guns album, Black Diamonds, is in the can. I don't have a release date yet. I would imagine probably the second quarter of 23, but I don't really know. People keep asking, and frankly, I don't know. But new LA Guns record's done. Last week was the 1-year anniversary of our last record, Checkered Past, which is really proud of that. And if you're thinking about getting a pet, dog, cat, squirrel, raccoon, possum, whatever, find a local shelter, or even better, if you just want to try it on for size, consider fostering. We need more fosters out there for dogs and cats and domestic pets. It really alleviates some of the pressure that the local shelters and rescue organizations are struggling with. So if you think you could have a dog or a cat or a woolly mammoth in your house for a month or 2, like I do here with little Sleeping Willow to my right, or your right, I guess, take one in.
My wife is, because we have 2 cats right now. We had 3 for a while. Unfortunately, one passed away last year. They're all older dudes. Yeah, I can't believe how attached I am, because I was not a cat person until I met her.
Yeah.
And now I can't imagine my life without him. And she's like, we should take in all the senior cats. I want to be like Beth Stern. We're gonna be crying every day. We can do what we can to help. We donate to animal charities. We can't do that. We're gonna be crying. By the way, I'm also highly allergic to cats and dogs.
Same. Oh, I'm definitely allergic to cats.
Love it, but I get the allergy shot, so I'm able to breathe.
Good.
They should make a horror movie about that. Just dying of allergies.
Yeah.
No, it's not. That's what I
real.
talk about. Too real.
Yeah.
So thanks again, Ace. Thanks for everybody to welcoming me to your horror family. I know there's 1,000,001 horror podcasts out there. I hope you're taking time to listen to Appetite for Horror. I want to interview the best of the best and just the coolest people. I've seen so many horror movies. There's so many things to talk about. Let's see where this goes. I do want to talk more about the Metal and Horror documentary as we go forward. But again, social media, Appetite for Horror on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I'm going to end a quote. I'm going to, as I'm figuring these things out, I'm ending the song with something else, another ditty by Sister Midnight and Steve Darrow from Rose. But I want to end with a quote, and I'm going to try to figure this out over these past 2 episodes. I'm going to end with something with Killer Clowns from Outer Space. See if it makes sense. It probably does. What are you going to do with those pies, boys?